The crack of a gavel echoed through the community center as Deborah Winter's face flushed with righteous indignation. 3 neighbors had just voted against her proposal to ban bird feeders in Sycamore Heights, and she wasn't having it. "Perhaps you didn't hear me correctly," Deborah said, her voice razor-sharp as she adjusted her perfectly coiffed blonde bob. "These feeders are attracting vermin. The HOA bylaws clearly state that nothing shall diminish property values in our community." The room fell silent. Everyone knew that when Deborah invoked property values, she was just getting started. Jason Miller, a new homeowner who'd made the grave mistake of installing a feeder without approval, shifted uncomfortably in his metal folding chair. "It's just a small cedar bird feeder. My daughter loves watching the Cardinals." Deborah's thin smile never reached her eyes. "How sweet. Unfortunately, sentiment doesn't supersede our community standards, Mr. Miller." As president of the Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association for 6 consecutive years, Deborah had perfected the art of wielding the rulebook like a weapon. Her 2-story colonial on Maple Court was the neighborhood's crown jewel. Immaculate landscaping, compliant exterior paint, agreeable gray Southwest 7029, one of only 8 approved colors, and not a holiday decoration displayed a day beyond the permitted time frame. "The board will conduct a property inspection next week," she announced, scribbling in her leather-bound notebook where she meticulously documented every neighborhood infraction. "I've noticed several other issues requiring immediate attention." Eleanor Santos, who'd lived in Sycamore Heights for 20 years, longer than anyone else in the room, cleared her throat. "Deborah, don't you think we're getting a bit excessive? Last month, there was the height of grass clippings, now bird feeders." Deborah's smile tightened. "Rules exist for a reason, Eleanor. Without them, we'd have trampolines and inflatable Santas year-round." She shuddered at the thought. Next thing you know, someone will want to paint their door crimson. What Deborah didn't mention was how she flagrantly violated those same bylaws last summer when she installed a koi pond without proper approval. The board, largely consisting of her friends and those too intimidated to challenge her, had retroactively granted permission in a hastily called special session. As the meeting adjourned, Deborah collected her designer handbag and clipboard. Outside, she paused to take photos of a potted plant on the Thompsons' porch that exceeded the 18-inch height restriction. What she didn't notice was the new family moving in across the street, the Reynoldses. With their 3 children, a rescue dog, and Nathan Reynolds, a property attorney specializing in HOA disputes. Deborah drove home in her white Mercedes, already drafting violation notices in her head. She had no idea that the dynasty she'd built was about to face its most formidable challenge yet, or that within 6 months, her immaculately maintained world would crumble around her. As she pulled into her driveway, her phone buzzed with a text from board member Margaret. "Emergency situation at the community pool. Someone's child vomited in the water. Health hazard." Deborah's jaw clenched. Perfect. Another crisis requiring her intervention. She turned her car around, unaware that this seemingly routine incident would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually cost her everything. Deborah screeched to a halt at the community pool, her heels clicking aggressively across the concrete as she marched toward the gathering crowd. The afternoon sun glinted off her oversized sunglasses as she surveyed the scene with thinly veiled disgust. "Everyone out. The pool is closed," she announced, fishing her master key from her purse to lock the gate. "Health code violation. Section 12, paragraph 4 of the community bylaws clearly states." "Excuse me," interrupted a calm male voice, "but I believe the protocol is to test the water before shutting down the entire facility." Deborah turned to face Nathan Reynolds, still in his moving clothes, holding a pool testing kit. She hadn't expected to confront one of the new residents so soon. "And you are?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. "Nathan Reynolds, my family just moved in today." He extended his hand, which Deborah reluctantly shook. "I was getting the kids settled and they wanted to check out the pool. Fortunately, I'm certified in pool maintenance." "How convenient," Deborah replied, watching suspiciously as Nathan tested the water. "Chlorine levels are perfect," he announced. "Whatever happened has already been neutralized. The pool is safe." The gathered families cheered, much to Deborah's annoyance. Children eagerly jumped back into the water. "I'm Deborah Winters, HOA president," she finally introduced herself. "In the future, Mr. Reynolds, please remember that all pool incidents must be reported to the board immediately." Of course, Nathan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll be sure to review all the bylaws. All of them." Something about his emphasis made Deborah uneasy. As she walked away, she heard a mother thanking Nathan, calling him a real lifesaver. By Monday morning, Deborah had conducted thorough research on the Reynolds family. Nathan was indeed an attorney specializing in property law and HOA disputes. His wife, Maya, was a landscape architect. They had 3 children and a golden retriever that already exceeded the community's 30-pound pet weight restriction. Perfect ammunition for her first warning letter. She spent the morning drafting violation notices, the Miller's bird feeder, the Thompsons' oversized potted plant, and now the Reynolds' overweight dog. She was particularly meticulous with the latter, citing specific weight restrictions and including printouts of similar golden retrievers exceeding the limit. Later that afternoon, Eleanor Santos called with disturbing news. "Have you seen the community forum?" Eleanor asked, her voice tinged with worry. Deborah hadn't. She immediately logged in to find a new topic. Know Your Rights, HOA Authority and Limitations. It was posted by Nathan Reynolds and already had 37 comments. The post outlined homeowners' rights to reasonable use of their property, the requirement for HOA boards to follow their own rules consistently, and the legal consequences when they didn't. Nathan had even cited relevant state laws and case precedents. Most alarmingly, he mentioned the selective enforcement of rules, giving a hypothetical example of a board member installing unapproved landscaping features while penalizing others for minor infractions. It was clearly about her koi pond, someone had told him. That evening, Deborah convened an emergency call with her closest board allies. "This Reynolds situation needs to be contained," she insisted. "Margaret, I want every violation on their property documented. Patricia, review their move-in paperwork for any discrepancies. We need leverage." What she didn't realize was that Nathan had anticipated this reaction. While Deborah plotted her counterattack, he was methodically gathering evidence of her years of selective rule enforcement and documenting every procedural violation the board had committed under her leadership. As Deborah ended the call, she glanced out her window to see Nathan walking his golden retriever past her house. The dog paused to sniff her meticulously maintained lawn. Nathan looked up, caught her watching, and waved with a pleasant smile that chilled her to the bone. The quarterly HOA meeting was more crowded than usual. Deborah arrived early to find extra chairs already set up and nearly every seat filled. Whispers quieted as she walked to the front, her smile fixed in place despite the knot forming in her stomach. "I'd like to call this meeting to order," she announced, rapping her gavel with perhaps more force than necessary. The usual agenda items passed quickly until they reached new business. Nathan Reynolds raised his hand. Deborah reluctantly acknowledged him. "I'd like to discuss the approval process for architectural modifications," he said pleasantly. "Specifically, I'm curious about the expedited approval of certain projects while others languish for months." Deborah's fingers tightened around her pen. "We follow the bylaws meticulously, Mr. Reynolds. The board evaluates each request based on community standards." "Interesting," Nathan replied, opening a folder. "I have compiled a spreadsheet of all modifications approved in the last 3 years. Applications from board members were approved in an average of 3 days, while other homeowners waited an average of 47 days. Murmurs rippled through the room. Deborah's face flushed. "Furthermore," Nathan continued, "I noticed that your koi pond installation last July received approval despite exceeding the maximum water feature dimensions outlined in Section 8.3 of the Architectural Guidelines." The room fell silent. Deborah's mind raced. How had he obtained those records so quickly? "That installation had special considerations," she stammered. "Such as?" Nathan pressed. "The board determined it enhanced property values," Deborah replied, regaining her composure. "Now, if we could move on to—" "One more question," Nathan interrupted. "Is it true that you've issued violation notices to 5 families for bird feeders, citing vermin concerns, while your own koi pond creates standing water that's a documented mosquito breeding ground?" Eleanor Santos gasped audibly. Patricia, Deborah's most loyal board ally, suddenly became very interested in her notepad. "This is becoming disruptive," Deborah snapped. "We need to move on." But the damage was done. For the first time in 6 years, Deborah lost control of a meeting. Homeowners peppered her with questions about other inconsistencies. Jason Miller asked why his children's basketball hoop received a violation while board member Tom Wilson's identical hoop did not. When the meeting finally adjourned, Deborah was seething. She cornered Margaret in the parking lot. "Who gave him access to those records? Was it you?" Margaret looked stricken. "No. But Deborah, he submitted a formal request. As secretary, I had to comply with the bylaws." "You should have warned me," Deborah hissed. That night, Deborah paced her immaculate living room, fuming. This upstart attorney needed to be taught a lesson about Sycamore Heights hierarchy. She'd faced challenges before: the Paddles who wanted to install solar panels, the Wilsons who fought for a backyard playground, and she'd squashed them all. The Reynolds would be no different. The next morning, she spotted Nathan's children playing in their front yard with their golden retriever. Perfect. She grabbed her phone and began recording, capturing footage of the dog without a leash, the children's bikes left on the sidewalk, and a small American flag displayed outside the approved holiday schedule. 3 violations in one video. What Deborah didn't notice was Maya Reynolds quietly observing her from their kitchen window, taking her own photographs of Deborah's surveillance. That afternoon, Deborah personally delivered violation notices to the Reynolds home. Maya accepted them with a serene smile that made Deborah's blood boil. "Thank you for your diligence," Maya said. "We're learning so much about how things operate here." As Deborah walked away, she missed the significant look that passed between Maya and their neighbor Eleanor, who had emerged from her home across the street. Eleanor, the longest-standing resident of Sycamore Heights, had finally reached her breaking point with Deborah's tyranny, and she had 20 years of stories to share with the Reynolds family. Deborah stared at the email in disbelief. The subject line read, "Notice of special meeting? Vote of no confidence, HOA board president." Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the message, which detailed a petition signed by over 60% of Sycamore Heights homeowners calling for her removal. "This is outrageous," she muttered, reaching for her phone to call Patricia. But Patricia's response only deepened her shock. "I think you should consider stepping down gracefully," Patricia suggested, her voice gentle but firm. "Things have gotten out of hand, Deborah." "Out of hand? I've devoted 6 years to maintaining our property values." Deborah's voice rose to a pitch that startled even herself. "This is that Reynolds man's doing. He's turned everyone against me." "It's not just Nathan," Patricia countered. "Remember the Williams family who moved last year after you fined them repeatedly for their son's medical equipment in the driveway? Or the elderly Johnsons who couldn't afford to repaint their house in the exact shade you demanded? People have long memories, Deborah." The call ended with Patricia's resignation from the board, leaving Deborah truly alone for the first time since taking power. That evening, Deborah drove through the neighborhood, noting with mounting rage how many homes displayed subtle signs of rebellion against her rule. The Miller's bird feeder remained defiantly in place. The Thompsons had added a second oversized plant. Even Margaret had installed wind chimes explicitly prohibited under noise ordinance rules Deborah had implemented. She pulled into her driveway only to find a construction crew working at the community pool across from her home. Alarmed, she marched over to investigate. "What's going on here?" she demanded of the foreman. "Pool maintenance," he replied, checking his clipboard. "Approved by the board yesterday." "That's impossible. I'm the board president, and I approve no such thing." The foreman shrugged and showed her the work order signed by acting president Eleanor Santos. Deborah felt the blood drain from her face. Acting president? There must be some mistake. But there wasn't. While Deborah had been strategizing against the Reynolds family, Nathan had been educating residents about the HOA's emergency replacement provisions. The special meeting was standing room only. Deborah arrived precisely on time, dressed in her most authoritative pantsuit, her face a mask of calm determination despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. As she made her way to her usual seat at the front, conversations hushed momentarily before resuming with greater intensity. Eleanor Santos called the meeting to order from Deborah's customary position. "Before we address the petition, we have an urgent matter concerning community finances," Eleanor announced, nodding to Nathan Reynolds. Nathan rose, tablet in hand. "Thank you. While reviewing the HOA financial records, we've discovered some concerning discrepancies that require immediate attention." Deborah's heart hammered against her ribs. "What discrepancies?" "Our books are immaculate. I've personally overseen every expenditure." "That's precisely the issue," Nathan replied, connecting his tablet to the projector. A spreadsheet appeared on screen, highlighting years of financial transactions. Over the past 4 years, the landscaping contract for common areas has been awarded exclusively to pristine properties, despite receiving multiple lower bids. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Deborah maintained her composure, though her knuckles whitened around her leather portfolio. "Furthermore," Nathan continued, "Pristine Properties is owned by Jeffrey Winters, who I understand is your brother-in-law, Ms. Winters. There's no record this conflict of interest was ever disclosed to homeowners as required by state law." The room erupted. Deborah stood, her voice cutting through the chaos. "The board was fully informed. Pristine offers superior service." "At a 40% premium," Nathan interjected, switching to a new slide showing comparative bids, "costing this community approximately $112,000 in excess charges over 4 years. "These allegations are absurd," Deborah snapped, though panic began to rise in her throat. How had they uncovered the connection to Jeffrey? She'd been so careful. Eleanor stepped forward. "We've consulted with a forensic accountant who's identified additional irregularities." She gestured to an unfamiliar woman who rose from the back row. "Ms. Chen will explain her preliminary findings. My analysis indicates that approximately $37,500 of HOA funds were diverted to personal expenses," Ms. Chen stated clinically, "including landscaping for a private residence, materials for a water feature, and several unexplained cash withdrawals." The koi pond, her pride and joy. Deborah felt the room spinning. This wasn't happening. "These are slanderous accusations," she declared, gathering her belongings. "I won't dignify them with a response. My attorney will be in touch." As she turned to leave, Jason Miller blocked her path. "We're not finished, Deborah. There's still the vote." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur. One by one, homeowners approached the microphone to share their experiences under Deborah's reign: arbitrary fines, delayed approvals, selective enforcement. The couple who lost a sale because Deborah had interfered with their buyer. The widow who'd been harassed over her late husband's memorial garden. The family who spent thousands fighting a violation over their child's medical access ramp. When the votes were tallied, the result was nearly unanimous. 127-3 for removal. Only Margaret and Tom Wilson had stood by her, and even they could meet her eye as she finally fled the community center. Driving home, Deborah's phone buzzed repeatedly with text messages from her increasingly concerned attorney. The final one read simply, "Do not destroy any financial recourse. Call me immediately." She pulled into her driveway to find two unexpected sights: a news van from the local station and a police car parked across the street. A young reporter approached as she exited her vehicle. "Ms. Winters, Channel 7 News, we're doing a story on HOA fraud. Can you comment on allegations that you misappropriated over $37,000 in community funds?" Deborah pushed past without answering, hands shaking so badly she could barely unlock her front door. Inside, she sank onto her pristine white sofa and finally allowed herself to contemplate the unthinkable. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling, and for the first time in her life, Deborah Winters had no idea how to fix it. Dawn broke over Sycamore Heights, painting the immaculate houses in soft golden light. Deborah hadn't slept. Her eyes were red-rimmed as she peered through her blinds at the Channel 7 news van still parked across the street. Her phone had been ringing nonstop, her attorney, her brother-in-law Jeffrey, even her sister demanding to know why police officers had shown up at pristine properties with questions about fraudulent billing. When the doorbell rang, Deborah nearly jumped out of her skin. She cracked the door to find Officer Ramirez, the community liaison she cultivated a careful relationship with over the years. "Ms. Winters, I need to ask you some questions regarding a complaint filed by the Sycamore Heights HOA board," he said, his usual friendliness replaced by professional detachment. "Of course," she replied, ushering him in while glaring at neighbors who'd emerged from their homes to watch. "This is all a misunderstanding, officer. A vendetta led by new residents who don't appreciate what I've done for this community." Officer Ramirez remained standing. "Ma'am, the board has provided documentation showing unauthorized transfers from the HOA account to your personal accounts totaling $37,500 over 4 years." "Administrative errors," Deborah insisted, her voice higher than usual. "My attorney will clear everything up. There's also the matter of the construction permits," he continued. Deborah froze. "What construction permits?" "For your koi pond. According to county records, you submitted documents with forged homeowner signatures approving the variance." This was impossible. She'd been meticulous, covering every track. The only person who knew about the signatures was Margaret, who'd helped her. Margaret, who'd been avoiding her calls since yesterday. "I'll need all records related to HOA finances and these construction projects," Officer Ramirez concluded, handing her a document. "This is a formal request for information. Please have these ready by tomorrow morning." After he left, Deborah called her attorney, who delivered devastating news. The police had already obtained warrants for her bank records, and Jeffrey was cooperating with investigators to save his business. "They have everything, Deborah," her attorney said gravely. "The forged signatures, the inflated invoices, the kickbacks. Your best option now is to negotiate a settlement, pay back the funds, and resign from the board permanently." Desperation clawed at her throat. "That board position is my life, and I don't have $37,500. It went into the pond, a landscaping, my—" "Then sell your house," he interrupted bluntly, "because the alternative is criminal charges." That afternoon, the final blow came in the form of a certified letter from the county. Her koi pond was illegal, built without proper drainage permits, and was actively causing damage to the community pool foundation. She had 7 days to remove it and restore the property to code or face daily fines of $1,000. Desperate for allies, Deborah called an emergency meeting of her remaining supporters at her home. Only Tom Wilson showed up, and even he seemed uncomfortable. "What exactly happened with the pool construction fund?" he asked quietly. "Nothing happened," Deborah snapped. "Every penny is accounted for." Tom shook his head. "Eleanor showed me the bank records, Deborah. The money for the pool resurfacing last year, a lot of it went to your contractor for your koi pond." "That's absurd." "They have the canceled checks," Tom replied, standing to leave. "I'm sorry, but I can't be involved anymore. My wife is furious that I supported you this long." Alone again, Deborah paced her living room until a movement outside caught her eye. Nathan Reynolds was across the street at the pool construction site, deep in conversation with the foreman and several workmen who were pointing directly at her property. She watched in growing horror as one worker uncovered a portion of her elaborate drainage system, the unofficially modified system that diverted water from her quote pond directly to the community drainage behind her property, bypassing required filtration systems and undermining the pool's foundation in the process. For 6 years, Deborah had ruled Sycamore Heights through fear, intimidation, and her encyclopedic knowledge of the HOA bylaws. Now, those same rules and regulations were being used to dismantle everything she built. The for sale sign appeared in Deborah's front yard on a Tuesday morning, drawing neighbors to their windows like must of flame. By afternoon, whispers had evolved into a neighborhood-wide text chain. Deborah Winters was leaving Sycamore Heights. No one was more shocked than Margaret, who received a terse voicemail from Deborah demanding she retrieve her personal items from the HOA office before they were disposed of like everything else in this godforsaken community. Inside her house, Deborah was frantically shredding documents when her doorbell rang again. This time, it wasn't Officer Ramirez, but a stern-looking woman in a charcoal suit who introduced herself as Detective Hartman from the Financial Crimes Division. Ms. Winters, we have a warrant to search these premises for documents related to the Sycamore Heights HOA finances, she stated, handing Deborah a legal document. 2 uniformed officers stood behind her. Deborah's hands trembled as she reviewed the warrant. This is harassment. I've already agreed to sell my home to repay any discrepancies. This isn't about civil restitution anymore, Detective Hartman replied. The county prosecutor is pursuing criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and document forgery. Step aside, please. For 3 excruciating hours, officers methodically boxed up files from Deborah's home office, photographed her koi pond, and confiscated her computer and phone. The detective paid particular attention to a locked file cabinet in Deborah's closet, which contained the original architectural plans for her water feature, plans that clearly showed it had been designed to divert runoff toward the community pool's foundation. As the officers loaded evidence into their vehicles, neighbors gathered on sidewalks to watch. Deborah remained inside, curtains drawn, ignoring the doorbell when the Channel 7 reporter returned seeking comment. That evening, her realtor called with devastating news. A potential buyer had expressed interest but withdrew upon learning about the drainage issues. The koi pond would need to be completely removed and the land restored before any sale could proceed, a process estimated to cost upwards of $20,000. And frankly, Deborah, the realtor, added hesitantly, the publicity isn't helping. The HOA investigation was mentioned in the county paper this morning. Sleep-deprived and desperate, Deborah made a catastrophic decision. At 2:17 a.m., security cameras captured her approaching the community pool construction site carrying a large bag. Inside was quick-setting concrete mix, which she began pouring into exposed drainage pipes, the same pipes that were being examined as evidence of her fraudulent construction. She might have succeeded if Nathan Reynolds' golden retriever hadn't needed a late-night walk. The dog's unexpected barking startled Deborah, causing her to drop her phone. The flashlight beam caught Nathan's attention from across the street. "Deborah, what are you doing out here?" he called, approaching cautiously. She fled, leaving behind the half-empty bag of concrete mix and her phone, containing text messages to her brother-in-law discussing ways to fix the drainage problem permanently. By morning, construction workers discovered the sabotage attempt. The concrete had only partially set, but removing it would add thousands to the repair costs. Officer Ramirez returned with a colleague, this time with handcuffs. The arrest of Sycamore Heights' former HOA president was witnessed by half the neighborhood, including Eleanor Santos, who watched with a complex mixture of indignation and sadness as Deborah was escorted to a police cruiser. Criminal mischief, tampering with evidence, and attempted destruction of property, Officer Ramirez recited as he helped Deborah into the back seat. "You've ruined me," she hissed, glaring at Nathan, who stood silently on his front lawn. "Are you happy now?" Nathan shook his head. "This was never about ruining anyone, Deborah. It was about fairness. The same rules have to apply to everyone." As the police car pulled away, Deborah caught a final glimpse of her dream home, the pristine colonial with perfect landscaping, and the now infamous koi pond that had triggered her downfall. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very symbol of her status and power had become the instrument of her destruction.